Welcome, everyone. This is an exciting moment for us because we are having our first live Kavli conversation in almost 3 years here at 20 Cooper Square, which is great. I'm Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism at NYU and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting program and the science communication workshops at NYU. And we are very grateful to all of you for coming in person and all the folks who are watching the live stream. And as always, we're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation, whose support makes this series possible. They've stuck with us through the pandemic, and now that we're forging on full steam ahead with COVID precautions, but still full steam ahead at 20 Cooper Square. Part of the new look of the Kavli Conversations is a new co-moderator. We have two moderators, Anna Rothschild, who you'll meet in a couple more conversations, and Robin Lloyd, who is here today. Robin is a veteran science journalist. She has been an editor at many major publications as well as a writer. She is the president of the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing and an important figure in our industry, and soon will be a visiting scholar at NYU Journalism. So I will leave it to Robin to formally introduce our guests, but we're very grateful to them for making the trip. Thank you. And with that, Robin, take it away.
Thanks, Dan. I just want to welcome everyone again for coming and really thank you, everyone, for being here for this conversation. It's a very timely conversation tonight. The topic that we have, it's very important. As Dan mentioned, I'm not sure he did actually, we're going to be talking about covering the trans health crisis. Media coverage of trans or transgender issues, including health issues affecting children and adults today, has increased dramatically in the last several years. But one of the points that our speakers have emphasized in their work, our guests, is that much of this media coverage is conveying misguided and mistaken information about the experiences and history of trans people and children. For instance, one of our guests, Dr. Jules Gill-Peterson, has done extensive historical research that shows that trans children existed as far back, at least as the early 20th century in the United States, and as she writes in the conclusion of her book, Histories, I highly recommend this, Histories of the Transgender Child, trans children are not new. As science and health journalists and writers, we of course have a responsibility to cover trans lives and health issues in the most thoughtful, accurate, productive, and equitable ways as possible. One basic answer to the question we have tonight, covering the trans health crisis, how can we do this best, how can we improve and do better at this, is to listen to and tell the stories of trans children and trans adults, which we have not been doing adequately. It's definitely not clear that we've been doing a great job to date. We live in a time, as any of you reading the news can see, when trans people are facing a crisis along numerous dimensions in the United States and beyond, including state-level oppression and opposition to the very existence of trans people. So I don't think I'm going to define the trans health crisis. I want to get right to our conversation, but that's something to think about. This is more than access to gender-affirming treatment and surgery and support and hormones. Of course, these issues affect all of us, both trans people and non-trans or cis people, such as myself. I'm an outsider to the trans experience in many ways, but it's my hope that I can be a stand-in for thoughtful non-trans or cis journalists who are covering the trans health care crisis right now. I do plan to speak as little as possible tonight. So let me introduce our guests. We have Tuck Woodstock, who is a journalist, an educator, and an audio producer. He co-founded Sylvian Consulting, for which he frequently leads workshops on gender and workplace equity, and has consulted on projects for clients including This American Life and Sony Pictures. Tuck also hosts the award-winning podcast Gender Reveal, which has released 9 seasons. This is a wonderful podcast. I highly recommend it. I have so many more episodes I want to listen to still. And Dr. Jules Gill-Peterson is an associate professor, congratulations on tenure, of history at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. She is the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, published in 2018 by University of Minnesota Press. This book, which won a Lambda Literary Award, demolishes the widespread lie that transgender children are a brand new and solely white generation that has emerged just in the 21st century. Dr. Gill-Peterson is a general co-editor at Transgender Studies Quarterly, and she also writes the newsletter Sad Brown Girl, which is published on Substack. So I think I'm going to jump right in, and I mean, Dr. Gill-Peterson, your book is very much about how and why gender got medicalized in the first place, but could you briefly lay that out a little bit for everyone? How did we get in this mire?
Sure. It's the million, billion, trillion-dollar question. But also just want to say thank you, everyone, for coming out, and thanks for hosting both of us. I just couldn't, think of anyone I would rather be in conversation with more. And I think there are a number of answers to that question, but there's sort of, I think, maybe multiple time scales to think about, right? Most recently, we're still all sort of riding out this wave of the politicization of trans people and trans lives, trans healthcare in particular, in an age where trans people, trans issues, and certain kinds of trans people have become very hyper-visible in the world, particularly trans women of color and also trans youth. But that really, for me, builds on processes that go much, much, much further back, right? And so, I think part of the answer to the question is thinking about why, certain people's genders have become objects of debate and contestation, for a general public, right? Or have become the object of, even the object of medicalization in the first place, right? And I think one of the maybe broader questions and challenges to hold in mind, I might put sort of this way, right, is like, we have this sort of regime of sex and gender that is administered through medicine, through law. Obviously, everyone is affected by it. And, perhaps to some degree negatively, right? But certain people have been sort of singled out as the problems with gender, right? Or as if only some people have gender, or all these sorts of things I'm sure you've heard versions of out in the world, right? Only some people have pronouns, only some people take hormones, only some people seek health care related to their gender, when in fact, of course, everyone does to some extent. But I really think that, we've seen quite a profound kind of shift in the last 10 years to really isolating trans people and sort of exceptionalizing them and really putting the spotlight on them. When in fact, one of the interesting and complicated stories that I try to tell in my book is that, our very sort of Western scientific and medical concepts, technologies, just baseline ideas about what it means to have a body, what it means to be male or female, what it means to be masculine or feminine, were largely derived out of experimentation on people, who have been labeled as abnormal, intersex people, trans people in particular. And so in fact, trans people or intersex people, their sort of, lives are actually entangled up with everyone's in really complicated ways. And, that doesn't necessarily provide us a roadmap for figuring out what to do today, but I think it's often a nice place to sort of check in at the beginning and think about how in fact we're all, unfortunately, subject to the same history, but it weighs on different populations incredibly, incredibly differently. Yeah.
How many trans adults and trans children today who want access to care, gender-affirming care, and all kinds of health care actually get it?
I mean, I feel like this is something, Tech and I were chatting about earlier today, no way to know, but the answer is definitely very few, not enough, right? And I say that, with a certain energy because, feels like every week there's an article that's so weird. There are some young people accessing healthcare. It's yeah, that's not the weird part. The weird part is that there's not more, except it's not weird at all, right? I think, one of the most difficult things to grasp about trans healthcare, I curious to hear how you'd answer this question too, is like, we have no idea. There's no bird's eye view. There's no singular thing called trans healthcare. It's not clear that there needs to be. It's not, there are plenty of standards of care and international organizations and blah, 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 right? But, like most healthcare in the United States, very few people have access to it. It's incredibly difficult to get access to. There are about 100 million roadblocks in your way, and a lot depends on the discretion of individual providers. So even if you're going to a doctor, doesn't mean you're getting anything resembling adequate, competent, informed health care. And then, you could look at other countries too. The situation is not necessarily better in countries with public or socialized healthcare systems. In fact, in some ways it can be dramatically worse. Say in the UK, for example, where, especially for young people, there basically effectively is no health care for trans youth in the UK because the waiting list is so many years long that you basically would either age out or you just can't wait that. No one can be forced into that situation. So I think, unfortunately, right, the answer to that question is sort of like, we don't know, but that almost certainly means it's even worse than we could possibly imagine. And also is getting worse almost every day, or certainly every legislative cycle. So that's sort of, I don't know, those are some of my answers, but you should add your own.
Yeah. Also, I haven't talked yet, so thank you for having me. And Jules, I normally am the expert in this conversation, and it's nice to be in a position where I can be like, Jules, you go ahead.
Well, same.
But it's nice. But yeah, I would also say there's no way to know. It's good that there's no way to know, because if there was a database about every single person who accessed something called trans healthcare, like, we would be in worse trouble than we already are. But I would also say that, like, there's not like a neat binary of like, have you accessed trans healthcare, right? Like, trans healthcare can look like a lot of different things. Of course, famously, that not only trans people access, but more than that, we can ask questions like, okay, even if this person like accessed trans healthcare, how long did it take them? How many providers did they have to go to before someone said yes? How many different appointments did they have to go to before someone said yes? How many times did they have to change their insurance provider before they found an insurance provider that would cover it? How long did they have to work a job they didn't want to work at because that was the job that had the insurance that would cover the procedure? For example, like, this is changing now. Starbucks famously had like pretty decent trans coverage for healthcare, so a lot of trans people would work at Starbucks instead of like in their field because it could cover their surgeries. Now, Starbucks is saying that specifically at Starbucks locations that are unionizing, they're going to perhaps take away that trans coverage because trans people are disproportionately involved with unionizing. Which
So that's
is
evil.
Yeah, I mean, it's illegal, but they are still doing it. And we can also think about like how many like weird lies about ourselves did we have to tell a medical provider before they would give us something? Like, what did we have to like, what script did we have to read them before they would give us access to something? How many of those doctors are like letting us control our care? Like, they can decide like how we're taking hormones, how much hormones we're taking, what our surgeries look like. And so, yeah, there's no way to answer this is the short version, but I just really want to be asking these questions because I think, we're here to talk about sort of the failings of trans healthcare journalism, and I think it really is presented as sort of like this many people accessed trans healthcare and this many people didn't, when really like there's this huge spectrum of like what we're able to actually access, and even if someone like, quote unquote accessed healthcare, that doesn't mean that they're like getting what they want or need out of it, or didn't do that after like many, many years of fighting for what they want.
Right. I mean, a lot of what you've laid out is the answer to my next question, which is what makes trans healthcare any different, or gender affirming healthcare for trans people any different from that same identical healthcare given to non-trans people?
Yeah, and I think it's like, this is one of the questions I wish had been at the forefront of journalistic coverage for the last 10 years, or forever, because it would have preempted a lot of discussion, because the honest answer is the only difference is transphobia. It's like, and I will say this as a historian of science, like from my perspective, studying the history of biology, endocrinology, embryology, history of medicine, not that remarkably different to be trans. It's like, it's the same hormones, you're just plugging them in differently. The human body has a remarkable and actually, evolutionarily demonstrated capacity to change sex. I'm happy to say that and happy to vouch for it. But there's this whole regime that has been carefully constructed, over almost a century, but really in earnest since the 1950s, this regime that we've, long referred to as a kind of gatekeeping regime, right? So the system that was first set up to determine, basically if someone really deserved access to healthcare. And that, I think, is what I mean when I say transphobia, right? If you're going to discriminate against a population that needs almost identical healthcare, or let's just say, all healthcare ends up being, delivered in a somewhat personalized manner, right? But if you're going to discriminate against one group, merely because they belong to an unpopular group, then that's, a kind of transphobia, right? But ultimately, this sort of gatekeeping regime, really is based on the idea of merit, deservingness, right? Which is not, unfortunately, not foreign to most healthcare delivery, ultimately, right? Patients are routinely denied care, all over the world, but especially in this country, if they're not seen as legitimate or deserving. But trans people in particular have to live under the shadow of almost 70 years of constructing an entire apparatus whose primary mission is to stop as many people as possible from accessing care. That's like deliberately the point of the system, right? And so in the 1950s, it was a doctor's job basically to decide on a whim if he thought, someone sitting before him was, deserving, right? And you can imagine what kind of criteria that ended up, translating into in real life. Very disturbing, right? And, today, ostensibly, we have this sort of gender-affirming care model. And the big innovation of that model is that, in theory, a clinician's job is not to decide if you are truly transgender or not, right? In theory, right? But your insurance probably is like, yep, you 100% have to decide that or you're not getting any coverage, right? And then most clinicians, it's absurd. There's this evaluative role, right? So trans people getting access to a prescription for testosterone or estrogen have to be evaluated for their, basically their deservingness, but it can be dressed up as competency or whatever, right? In a way that just any other person would not be subject to a formal evaluative process with intentional roadblocks trying to get in the way, right? And so I think that ultimately, is a really wow, right? What if we always started this conversation from that premise, that there's no meaningful distinction but, animus, social stigma directed against a minority population? I think that really sort of shakes up the distinction. Not to say that it's not helpful to have specialists in certain fields or whatever, right? But broadly speaking, especially if we take a primary care approach, there is no meaningful distinction. Most gender-affirming care is consumed by non-trans people. It always will be. There's just way more of them, right? So, yeah, but...
Oh yeah, I just want to say really quickly, just to answer that question really literally, because so when I first actually I'll back up more and say that I was on estrogen for many years before I was on testosterone. In fact, you could argue I'm not even, you could argue. In fact, I am still on estrogen today in various ways, medically, over the counter. And that's not gatekept from me, right? The same way that it would be gatekept from Jules. But on the flip side of that, when I went on testosterone, the very first time that I got my prescription filled, they accidentally gave me the wrong person's prescription, and it was some guy named Paul in Vancouver, Washington. And then when I got my prescription filled instead, it was, of course, the exact same thing. It was just to me instead. And I opened up all of the, the paperwork that comes on your prescription that says all of the details. And it's so funny because being a trans person going into getting hormones, you have to hear all of the, things they're trying to do to scare you out of it, where they're like, you could die somehow. We don't know how, but I'm sure you could, all of these terrible things could happen to you. You'll never be a woman again or whatever. And then you look at the actual paperwork that comes with testosterone that when some guy gets it and it just says your prostate might get messed up. And I was like, cool, I don't have to worry about that. So it's the same thing. But it's just treated really, really differently.
Story. I think there's a story to be told right there. We're getting so many story ideas hopefully tonight. Thank you. So one of the things I'm thinking about a lot from reading your book, Dr. Gill-Peterson, is just the medical model. It's so powerful. It's so institutionalized to the point that it's invisible to a lot of us, I think. Even if we cover healthcare, sometimes it's hard to get outside of it. So definitely for details on that with trans healthcare, take a look at histories of of the transgender child. But can either of you talk a little bit about how reporters might want to cover trans healthcare in ways that is not locked into that mode? Because there is so much coverage, and we'll talk about the New York Times story, for instance, that is very locked into that model and all of its shortcomings.
Yeah, this is the heart of it, I think. And from my perspective, I would say a couple of things. A little easier for me to say this as a scholar. I'm like, go meta. But I think there has to be a reflection built in, right? Because we live in an era where there's a lot of disinformation already circulating. We've all been formed by it. We're all primed by it. Readers and audiences are already unconsciously having absorbed a ton of information that is deliberately designed, right, to mislead them or further some sort of political agenda, right? And that may not have been true 15 years ago or even 5 years ago in the way it's true today. And so I think part of the challenge is asking, up front, why are trans stories always framed through medicine? I mean, obviously, if states are explicitly banning, I was just reading a district court opinion on the train up here, so this is in my head, right? If you're banning specific medical procedures that are endorsed by every major medical association, like, okay, we should probably write stories about that, right? But more broadly, like how do you do thoughtful science journalism, right? That's sort of critical about having to, how do you sort of write a story that's critical about having to write the story in the first place, right? And I know that that's not always going to work for every particular moment. But so, my answer is often to think about, history. It's like, well, why is this happening now? What actually, and just to think a little bit about what it means for trans people to have been conflated with the medical establishment. And one of the reasons why I think that's so important is because, first of all, trans people aren't the medical establishment, don't have much, if any, leverage or pull, often are directly harmed by it, have been horrifically harmed by it historically, carry a lot of baggage and trauma around that, and lives are routinely immiserated, and kind of ruined, by the medical establishment. So it's really, it's a little perverse, of course, to be conflated with the people who are sort of most directly responsible for harming you in your everyday life. And so, but if you break up that conflation, then all of a sudden I think the story, it's way more dynamic. You have two groups of people, right? And then you could start to sort of build out the architecture of, well, what's actually going on here, right? And why is medical authority the dominant authority allowed to speak for trans people? And when do trans people get to speak about it? And how did we get into that situation as well? Like, it's not a given that doctors would have authority. It's not actually a given that medical associations would have any authority here. That's the process of, decades-long struggle. And even if you can't necessarily, have a paragraph about that, right? How can you sort of think about sort of beginning from that sort of reflective, somewhat more critical space? So that to my mind would be maybe one place to start.
Yeah, my friend and colleague Sonia Dirks, who I think is a race reporter at NPR right now, she talks a lot about how all stories are stories about power. And so when we're looking for stories, often we're looking for like this one person who can be, like our lead into the story, and we can follow this one individual, which is a useful narrative tool to tell one individual story as sort of a lens for something broader. But I think that when we do that, we often miss the structural elements of it. And so things happen like, this is maybe slightly off topic from the medical model, but also maybe not. I did consult on This American Life piece, as was mentioned in my bio, and what happened was they were telling a story about this trans guy who went on T and his singing voice changed, as if that had never happened before. They're telling this story like, do you understand? This man took testosterone and his voice got lower. And it's like, yeah, bitch. At first it was hard, and then it was affirming. Like, yes, okay. And the thing is, like, that story has been told hundreds and thousands of times in every YouTube video and every TikTok that's ever been made by a transmasculine person. I've talked about it on my podcast with 3 separate people. It just is a thing that happens. And that was not present in the story. And so, like, a lot of my notes that they didn't take, and that's fine, it was like, you're not acknowledging here that this is actually like something that has happened over and over and over for decades. And so what you're telling me isn't new. And because it's not new, I need you to bring something new and interesting to it, because otherwise you're just telling me something that we've been saying for decades. And I think so many of the stories that's being written about trans people, the secret, like, backbone of the story, if you really look at it, is, did you know transsexuals exist? And if you know that trans people exist, then there actually isn't a story there for you, because like that was actually the reason that the person wrote a story, is someone who wasn't trans was like, I just learned about trans people. Everyone should know about this. They do exist. Debatably, you know, like maybe they exist. Do they exist? Let's find out. And so I just think that that's really one of the main things we can do, is like just treat that as truth. Also, I'm going to do a really unorthodox thing called walking away for a second to get a different drink, because I just realized I'm drinking sparkling water and then talking into a microphone, and that was a mistake. So when I walk away, I'm not just like, and I'm out, mic drop. Oh, just anything that is not going to sparkle. Thanks so much.
What's
anyway.
wrong with the sparkle? Not to put you on the spot.
Then it carbonates and then you try to talk. I don't know. Maybe
Right.
you're very powerful, but
No, I'm also not consuming any sparkling water. No, just to add to that, I mean, I think it's a bit of a counterintuitive point, and it's something I wrestle with myself, and so, you know, happy to put it to people who are thoughtful about this too, is like, you know, I'm genuinely ambivalent about the need for more education about trans healthcare for public audiences, in part because trans people have been construed as an object for public consumption, and the effects of that have been almost uniformly quite dangerous and damaging. And, you know, something that I'm, you know, I'll say what I'm, you know, speaking, say, to, you know, the anti-trans political violence that defines this moment, is speaking to a general audience. I don't think it's important to know that much about trans people. I don't think it's important to know anything really about gender identity or about the medical model or about gender theory. I mean, I just don't think it's important to know any of that to care about trans people or to show up for them. You know, if you're curious, that's awesome, right? But I don't think it's actually necessary to kind of have that informational input. And so I think there's a trick, though, right, is like, you know, not to say like, great, don't do this work, just like pack it up, we're done here tonight, folks, right? No, but, you know, I do think that sometimes, right, it's like the problem of the false dilemma that is sort of routinely platformed, especially by sort of papers of record and other, you know, quite important you know, journalistic outlets, is that they take really baroque, sort of out of context questions and sort of blow them up, right, in this sort of, did you hear, right? And it's like, well, who's the you and what did you hear? You know, it's like, there's sort of maybe a question about this one random like surgical technique. Like that's not really something that like hundreds of millions of people need to necessarily think about right now, because we're not in a situation where we can think about that responsibly, and there's no accountability for the runaway train effect of that, right? And so, you know, part of it too, I think, is trying to think about that, how to develop maybe a rubric, you know, or sort of a sieve, right, to take to reporting, and think about like, well, when do I need to go into a bunch of detail here, right? When do I need to get into, and you know, because it's like you call up a doctor, right, and they're gonna nerd out with you, right? I mean, they love to do it. Hey, great. You know, sometimes I like doing it with them, but that's their job. Their perspective is gonna be a medical perspective, right? But if you go and ask like 10 trans people about the same, right, that might just not, you know, it might not land that way. So there is this sort of tricky question too about not just like how can we be more accurate, how can we be more well-researched, how do we evaluate trustworthiness of sources, et cetera, in an age of disinformation, but actually on a broader level, when do we need to give, you know, it's like, I don't know, I just think about how often, you know, to my own bewilderment, I appear, you know, through people's radios in their car on NPR while they're driving, because every time I'm on NPR, I love NPR for this. Like, I will get so many emails from people who are like, hello, I live in this small town in Maine, and I was driving the other day, and you came through my radio, and thank you. And like, you know, I love that. It's like beautiful. But it always makes me think, I'm like, that's so weird. I feel actually very responsible in those moments, even if it's a 3-minute interview, right, to be careful about what I say, because, you know, it just comes out of your car speaker, right, or comes, you know, into your earphone, and I'm not there to follow up on that, right? I can't answer your questions, right? I also can't really be sure of the broader context, or, you know, we can never be sure of how people read or receive things, and so there is a sort of sensitivity here, you know, that obviously I think, you know, I wear quite intensely and personally, but also comes through my work, that I think is a tricky ethical question, but I think about it a lot, you know, when pieces come out that I find frankly unethical, just like, well, what sort of thought process does someone go through where they feel comfortable reporting in a certain way, and what kind of ethical forethought maybe would change how that story was written, or maybe not lead to it being written in the first place. I mean, these are sort of bigger, not to zoom out too much, but I think they're connected questions, right?
I know we need to move on to another question, but two things. One is, it's so nice that people email you and say what a nice time they had hearing you on NPR, because when I'm on NPR, people go, you use vocal fry, and that's disgusting. So anyway, but
How dare they? Vocal fry is beautiful.
I know, I literally will write back and I'll be like, it's queer culture. I'm doing it on purpose. But the other thing real fast is just, to your point of like bringing in medical details sort of unnecessarily, is Frankie De La Creta, I think, is one of the preeminent people covering sports and gender right now. And so often when they're pitching a story about trans people in sports, their editor at wherever they're pitching to will ask for like 5 paragraphs on testosterone science. And they're like, I actually don't want to write this story about testosterone science because that's not the point of the story. But it's what the story asked for. So I just wanted to add that as an example.
I thought maybe I would get the ball rolling on questions here. And just following up on that, I think that what a lot of us struggle with is, when is it the right time to ask a source about their own identity, and then when is it appropriate to incorporate it into the story? Sometimes it clearly is, but often it really isn't, and it feels gratuitous, and so or exploitive in some way, or just irrelevant at best. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that. I mean, Jules, you're quoted a lot, and how do you feel when you're when that becomes part of how you are presented? Is that okay, or is it not okay? Or and Tuck, same for you.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I think one thing I'll say, right, is like, here part of the kind of gut check-in, right, that registers for you in that, like, I don't know, right? Like, it's like, if your gut's telling you something, like, yeah, the gut's right about, well, okay, I don't know. But, like, what I want to say is, like, the gut that you have for all other reporting works for the trans beat too, right? And I'll use the example of myself because it's quite interesting to wear two hats. Of course, I worked very hard to get, to become a scholar and a researcher, and, have a certain set of credentials that I judge strategically useful in being sort of public facing. And so when I kind of very reluctantly, I'll add, made the decision to spend more time trying to help participate or shape a conversation, particularly around trans youth, because I was so concerned, but also felt like, damn, I really did write the book. So now I what am I just going to sit on it? That would feel too weird, right? And one of the reasons I'm pulled is because I am trans, right? Like, it really matters to me. It would matter to me if I wasn't, but it really matters to me. And I will say this, I've noticed, and having spoken to, I couldn't even tell you how many reporters at this point over the past few years, I've started to really develop a kind of, oh gosh, I could take the temperature real fast on a phone call or even by email, right? And I notice, it tends to all correlate, right? So the same journalist who I'm just really feeling like, hey, you seem like you did a lot of research. Appreciate you reaching out to me for whatever reason you did. Sounds like you've read some of my stuff before, maybe some more of my public-facing stuff, or listened to me, here and there, and sort of are upfront about, like, here's why I wanted to talk to you, right? In the course of that kind of conversation, it tends to often come up like, and hey, if you want to talk about yourself, here's a way I think that might fit into the story, but I don't want to presume that at all. And so up to you, right? And I appreciate that. I think it's, as easy as that. In most cases, right, because there is such a pressure, again, as Tuck was saying, to narrate trans coverage through the lens of individual struggle and strife, which, I have a lot of ambivalence about. But, at the same time, it's a little dissociative not to admit, it's like, I don't just go home at that, it's like I can never hang up my coat and go home, right? So, we're on the clock 24 hours a day, right? And so it's hard, that kind of objective, subjective line becomes quite blurry. And I think there's a certain level of authenticity in speaking to that. But ultimately, I think it's just about having that conversation in a, at the right moment. And I will say, it's, one is not required to have skin in the game to do this work. But I will say, when I speak to trans and non-binary journalists, more often than not, it's just like, whew, okay, you know what? I'm going to lean back in my chair at home for this conversation. I'm not on my total best behavior, and on the record, off the record feels very easy, and there's just like, there's so much, it's a lot, I think, depends on deadlines and like people who are working on long form stories where we can be in contact multiple times, be talking for a while, where I can get into a repartee. I'm like, that always ends up when I go and see, the pull quotes that made it in at the end. I'm like, oh, that felt really worth it to me. And those are often the ones where I might appear as sort of a person, a character, and not just Jules Gill-Peterson, author of Histories of which is fine, because sometimes that's all I want to be, because that's better for everyone. So I think there's no, perfect answer there, but it's great to be thoughtful about that. And sort of, I'm a big fan of always offering context. It's like 99% of how I teach, where I'm like, we're about to do this. Here's why we're going to do it, though. It's not because I know everything or because I have a PhD. It's actually often just because that's how people have done it for 100 years. That's really weird, right? Let's talk about it. And so, just being like, I'm working on this story. Here's why I wanted to talk to you. Here's what I think is really important. Here's how I'm getting at it. But I don't want to be presumptuous about how you'd like to participate. Having that conversation, I think, it's about establishing trust, right? And I think that's probably something I imagine is just a normal thing to do anyways, right? So I don't know. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, so I'm going to give you a little spiel that I would give if I was teaching a workshop, and I think honestly that most of you already know a lot of this, but I'm going to say it to you anyway. And if I was teaching, we'd have a big picture of Alf here. I don't know if any of you know who Alf are. You might be okay, great. It's
No,
big,
say who Alf is.
just big alien, just a big alien.
He eats
and
cats? Does
and
he
the
eat
thesis,
cats? Is that, what does he eat? Cats?
He eats cats. Yeah,
okay.
well, that's not why we're bringing him up, though.
Felt important to me.
Okay, so the thesis of this, which is why Alf would be there, is that trans people are not aliens. And so when we're going to talk about trans people, I almost said Alf, when we're going to talk about trans people, the key to me is just that we're talking about trans people the same way that we would talk about anyone else in a story, and that however you're talking about people and their genders and their pronouns, it's following some kind of internal logic. Because so often what we'll see, and in some cases, like in the New York Times, their style guide explicitly says to do this for some reason. They'll be telling a story where they're like, okay, there was a bank robbery and the robber was running away and people were chasing after him. And one of the witnesses was Joe Smith, who identifies as non-binary and uses they and them pronouns. And Joe said he went that way. And it's just like, why did we slow down the whole story to talk about Joe's pronouns? We didn't talk about how the bank robber identifies in terms of gender. We didn't talk about the bank teller identifies in terms of pronouns. But for some reason, we talked to one trans person. We had to stop the whole story and talk about gender. And even when we're talking about stories that are explicitly about gender or trans people, I believe this is the case in the recent New York Times Binder piece. Anytime they talk to someone who's trans, whether that's someone talking about their firsthand experience or whether that's someone like Jules who's weighing in sort of an expert position, if someone is trans, they will say comma who is transgender or comma who is non-binary. When they're talking to cis people, they don't do that. And so what you're doing when you say that, as many of you know, is you're doing this thing called explanatory comma, in which you are indicating to the audience what is assumed knowledge and what is sort of niche knowledge that they're not assuming that you know. And so, if I was explaining, and I'm sorry, I'm going on, but I'm on my soapbox now, Sam Sanders' example for this is when he went to NPR, people would explanatory comma Jay-Z in coverage, explain who Jay-Z was and what hip-hop was, but no one would explain what bluegrass was to him, And so it's that case with gender too, where when you're only ever explaining trans people with their weird genders and their weird pronouns, and we have to mention every time someone's trans because trans people have to announce themselves as trans or it's deceptive, but then you're not doing that for cis people. You're sending this message to your readers that says trans people are weird and you don't need to know about them, but we will always identify them when we see them because that's really important to us. And I think that that's a really dangerous message. And so long story short is just when we're talking about trans people in coverage, if you decide that it's important to identify who is trans in the story for some reason, you better also be identifying who is cis in the story and treating them exactly the same way. Or I'm going to tweet about you, and nobody wants that.
Delaney. And so I've been thinking a lot about an article in a certain paper of record that came out recently about how there are more trans teenagers choosing top surgery recently. And I had two questions. One, in your actual research of this history, have you found that to be true? And two, I'm wondering, didn't have any independently verifiable numbers. They were like, there are no statistics on this, but we asked some people and they said there's maybe like 200
And so that's
trans
going to be the
teenagers.
headline of the story.
Yes, yeah. But then very far down in the story, they also said, oh, but there have been thousands of teenagers who are getting either breast augmentation or breast reduction surgeries. And so I'm wondering if you think that doing a story like that can all be helpful to any population that's actually concerned other than the transphobes.
Yeah. One of those stories we've had to
I mean, it's the
digest
famous
lately.
"Did you know transsexuals exist?" story,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
it's just like, did you know about them? And if you
Right.
did, then you're like, well, that I don't need to read this story.
No, I know. I mean, it seems like, my honest opinion, is like, I don't know that we needed that story at all. I'm not sure what purpose it served other than to stoke actually like misinformation, because I mean, it's an interesting example though, because I think it speaks to one of the challenges around how neutrality sort of gets deployed today, right? Because there is this sort of thing that I've dissected in some of my writing as sort of the function of what I would call sort of liberal as in like liberal institution, kind of laundering more actually extremist political talking points, right? And so it's a really interesting dynamic, because often it's like it's not due to lack of reporting, right? Like, here's a story that like was based on research. People were there's a lot of information. They're often long, right? And they often contain information that directly refutes the headline, the lead paragraph, directly refutes many of the people prominently featured in the article, right? And so it's kind of this amazing thing, right, where it's like, well, technically, right? It's like, technically, have any crimes been committed? No, right? But like, it's very odd to write a piece that is undermined by itself, but only if you read all the way down to paragraph 18, right? And so I think that's the good example, right? Like, if we read that article closely, it's like, well, there's no story. There's no story because maybe some young trans teens get top surgery, but it's not that many people, and it's much less than everyone else. What? And then, as a historian, right, it's like, yeah, this is not a new surgical procedure. It's been around for a very long time. Young people have been accessing it for much longer than I've been alive. So what's the story? What's the story? Well, is the story that people can't access this procedure? Is the story that it's very expensive? Is the story that children are infantilized and not allowed to make decisions about their bodies? Is the story that it's nobody's business? I don't know, right? But none of those were the stories that we got. So I think it's a great example, right, of how, I often see this sort of, this kind of self-justificatory, right, approach. It's like, well, we've just got to know all of this. And it's like, why? Though you haven't explained that, because the things that we're supposed to know contradict the framing of the story. And at that point, my antennae are up, right? Setting aside, I mean, obviously politically, I just think it's bad. And I think it's harmful and wrong. But even if I were being nicer about that for a moment, right, it just doesn't pass a basic scrutiny test for me. That to me seems unethical.
Yeah, I mean, you said pretty much everything. I just want to sort of add some texture to it, because you quoted the phrasing that they used, which was choose top surgery, right, in the digital piece, which is really interesting framing, because it's like, I went to Chipotle and they were out of barbacoa, so I chose top surgery. Like, it's just like, it's not like just like a casual thing that people are making. But then for the print story, it actually ran A1, and we all know what that means with journalism school. It ran A1, and the headline in print was "Breast Removal Surgery on the Rise for Trans Teens," which I pulled up. If you saw me scrolling, I was not texting, it was for that. Breast removal surgery on the rise for trans teens. And then, like Jules said, you go in the story, and it's like, yeah, this is like 200 kids are doing it. And then meanwhile, as you said, like thousands of teens are getting some sort of cis-affirming gender surgery, right? Like girls getting tits, etc. Actually, that's all girls, cis women getting tits. And I think that is just, to your point, this weird thing where they wrote a headline that would make people that didn't read the story extremely mad, but then they were like, we don't want trans people to yell at us, So we will actually do something that I think is good, which is to mention that more cis people are getting gender-affirming surgery than trans people are. And I just thought that was so strange. That's the whole thing. I don't have a good punchline. It was very strange that they did that.
Well, maybe if the headline was, coverage of trans healthcare issues greatly distorts
Yeah,
the
truly.
numbers, but I don't know why that would be A1.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Marianne, did you want to ask a question yet?
Yeah.
Please, please.
So I think it's a pretty typical journalistic convention that when you are interviewing someone who's a minor, you need parental consent, or you need the parent there, or any number, probably depends on the publication. I don't know if there's laws around that. How can we as journalists push back on that? Should we be pushing back on that? Should we be thinking of sources who are minors any differently than we do sources who are adults, in particular when we're covering trans youth?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this a lot today and in general, and I would err on the side of not involving youth. I mean, it's tricky, right? Because I'm not like, don't let trans youth tell their own stories. I think they should, but I'm just going to give you sort of an illustrative example of what I'm saying, which is I was consulting on this piece for KQED that was a story about a family told through the perspective of the mom. And there was a trans child in that family, and the mom was dead naming and misgendering that child. And I was brought in to be like, how do we tell this story, who we're using one name and pronouns for, and the mom is using a different name and pronouns for this child. And I was like, you actually can't tell this story responsibly. There's no way to tell this story. We can reframe it and tell a different story. I think you could maybe just cut the kid out entirely, and I think you could still tell the same story. And I'm talking to the writer, and she got really overwhelmed, which makes sense because I was like, reframe your whole story. And so then she brought in her editor, and after like several minutes, the editor is like, oh, we got permission from the mom to use this kid's name and pronouns and details, but do you think maybe we shouldn't include them because they're a child and they can't consent because they're like 9? And I'm like, that's a great question, and I can't believe that this is the first time this has come up for you as an editor, but like, yes, if you want to create a blanket thing where you just don't put 10-year-olds' business on the radio because they're 10 and they can't meaningfully consent to that, even if their parents can consent to that, I think that's actually a really good policy, and I think it's an especially good policy for trans kids, but I think it's just a good policy in general. So I think that if you have a child who is maybe an older teen and they want to talk to you about a story and they don't want to have to get their parents' permission, that's like a whole separate thing, and that's not what I'm talking about, and I think that's useful. But I think when they get young enough, instead of being like, how can we tell these stories without parents' permission, it's almost like, is parent permission actually not enough? Because these parents can be putting their kids at risk in a specific way that they may or may not like realize that they're doing. So I think that's something, but.
So spot on, and I'll just add something small to that, which is, my sense of the breadth of coverage that is, broadly speaking, sort of trans affirmative or pro-trans, in the last few years is actually, I think, and rather curiously, actually kind of doubled down on the sort of figure of the imperiled innocent child, that there are innocent trans kids being harmed. And of course, on the one hand, I'm like, yeah. I mean, hello, it's America. We love an imperiled child, whether that child exists or not. But it's a curious choice to me because I'm like, that's exactly the figure of a child that's being weaponized against trans people. So I just don't believe that that's a successful strategy. And then in this country, an innocent child is almost exclusively always going to be coded white and, pretty middle class. And it basically, takes us into the realm of kind of national sentimental fantasy in a way that I think is really abstract and gets us very far away from what's happening. And so, I think one thing that's really interesting, like I'll go on all day, in my day job being like, there's nothing new about trans kids. The one thing that's new is like genuinely new is this presumption that trans children like ought to always be in the families they were born into, and that they're definitely going to be happy around their parents or guardians, that they're safe at home, they're safe around the people who have legal custodianship over them. Ooh, not so sure about that. So it's like a weird, it's like it's a tricky proposition, right? It's like we've got to save these kids from, these state legislators so that they can be returned back to the family home. I've seen this argument made at legislative subcommittees by parents, right? Of course, it's a very, very strong form of political argumentation in the United States. But broadly speaking, too, I just genuinely really worry about the trans kids whose lives are under the spotlight. Some of them are activists. I 100% I'm up at night worried about them. I don't even know them. I'm just like, that is no way to live your life. You've spent the last 6 years traveling to the state capitol every year to beg for basic human rights. Your life is all over the internet. You're going through adolescence, which is oh my God, I would not want to have that on the internet. And whatever, they're young, they're used to having no privacy, but I don't want to be a part of that, right? So I think there's a broader question too about how can we start to shift away? The only pro-trans narrative out there about youth is let's watch this child suffer in just horrific real time and follow their unending struggle. And it's just what happens then when you get to adulthood? I mean, there's just no reward for suffering like that. And so, yeah, I feel that way too, just from a more zoomed out, not involved in journalism sort of perspective. I'm I don't want to hear, it's like a joke between trans adults, but I think about how it must feel for kids all the time. It's just I just want to be left alone. I would love to not be known, except for my work. But it's it would be a relief to kind of disappear. And I think that part of what these kids don't have access to is not just privacy, but actually the right to sort of just be awkward and weird and not to have it, on the news. Yeah.
And I'll just add very quickly that I have talked to a lot of journalists about who should we talk to if we're not going to talk to trans youth, because we don't want to just talk to cis parents, but there are also, trans older teens and trans adults. And so I think one way to get around this and around your question is to talk to trans college students, trans people who were just aged out, or trans adults of trans kids who we maybe trust a little bit more to be spokes of trans kids. And I think those, and also just trans educators and counselors and people who are working directly with trans kids. And I think those are ways to get not just a random source of someone's mom, but authoritative sources who can speak to the experiences of trans kids without directly putting trans kids under threat.
Yeah. Just if I could just quickly follow up on that. I find that really interesting and maybe difficult from a journalistic point of view, because the 16-year-old who is capable of intellectual consent and is speaking their truth to a cis parent who doesn't want to hear that truth, that is compelling and important. It's not just compelling in a dramatic sense, but it's compelling in the sense of educating. And so it's hard to just say goodbye to that, under all circumstances from a journalistic point of view. And I wonder whether we really should, or whether there are circumstances where illuminating this with everyone's full consent is actually important in advancing the issue somehow, advancing respect.
Yeah, I do want to be clear that I was talking about 9, 10 rather than 16, 17. But I also will just say that the story of sometimes people's parents are transphobic has also been told many times. And I know for me, as an adult, I'll be teaching a class in the position of an educator. I'm the Jules in this situation. I'm up there talking about history and just sort of big conceptual things. And then I'll say, do you have any questions? And someone will say, how did you come out to your parents and what did they say? It's for some reason assumed that it is public right for people to know how trans people's family reacted to trans people being trans in a way that just doesn't make sense to me. And so I understand it sounding compelling to tell those stories, and I think I just have to circle back to being those stories have been told so many times already. We're still having transphobia despite those stories being told over and over and over again. It hasn't meaningfully shifted the conversation. And it is really traumatizing to have those stories out, especially out in the way that they cannot be taken back because they're on the internet forever. And there are really like fewer things than I want out in the world than the conversations I'm having with my mom about my gender. And I can imagine it would be more painful if I was a teen. So that's not to say we can never talk about it. Like, I'm not like the gender cop, you know, like you can write about anything you want. But I personally like would not see a meaningful benefit of writing that story for the like 17,000th time.
Well, and maybe one sort of, you know, big picture thing to chew on more broadly too, right, is, you know, and to be a little, you know, my academic hat a little bit more here, you know, so trans people have been framed as like this homogenous group, and we have this word trans or transgender, maybe sometimes it's trans and non-binary, and you know, for all the sort of tie-ins to diversity that are sort of out there in the ether, you know, one of my big axes to grind with this that I grind in my scholarship is like, I don't like the word. I don't think it's clear what all trans people have in common. I don't think it's clear that trans refers to an actually existing consistent group of people in the world. It's not clear to me that it has any purchase beyond the Anglosphere, and ultimately it's an incredibly ethnocentric term that only exists in the world due to really complicated, you know, histories of, among other things, colonialism, right? And it partly gets back to where we started tonight, which is like, how have trans people sort of been defined through medicine? And one of the challenges is that, in fact, you know, transgender was a word that came about in the 90s that was supposed to actually break radically from that kind of medical monopoly. And yes, it's actually been reconflated, but actually even when people step outside of the medical, that word trans is still doing the exact same flattening work. And so part of the question I have that's a bigger question that we can't necessarily answer in a sort of explicit way is, how could we move towards sort of, you know, giving up some of the power that word trans has as if it were explanatory, right? So it's like trans is supposed to include not just both of us, but 9-year-olds, right? It's supposed to include 70-year-olds. It's supposed to include people in other countries. It's supposed to include people who speak other languages, people who have money to go to the doctor, and people who don't. And it seems to me that part of what it does, and this is not a property of journalism, it's just what this word does in the world, is it actually it's causing us to miss a lot, right? I think it generally causes, it's a single axis lens. I think it can cause all kinds of confusion when it's like, what are we really talking about here, right? When it's like young people, it's like, are you really upset about trans? Or are you just like upset about children doing things, right? You're in the same way, it's like, oh, well, the same people are upset about 16-year-olds getting access to contraceptives at Planned Parenthood. So then at that point, to me, trans is not really an interesting operative word. It might actually be even a red herring, right, to drive a wedge. Or, you know, in all of the reportage about trans people, especially youth, like very hard to talk about race and class, very hard to talk about income inequality, very hard to talk about schools, school prison pipeline. You know, there's just so much that we haven't even begun to cover in a public way, because actually that word trans isn't getting us there. It doesn't have, it's just, you know, it just narrows, right? And so there are times we should use it, obviously. Like, I would be out of a job otherwise. But I mean, it's something I'm really passionate about, trying to think about, you know, how can we move towards a more complicated landscape? What would that look like, right? And so it might mean sometimes writing a story. I mean, I know this, you know, unfortunately, since this summer has been a conversation I've had with a lot of journalists, I want to cover abortion and reproductive care alongside access to trans care, because it's the same politicians banning both, it's the same legal logics affecting both, it's the same interest groups, right? And it's like, but then on the other side, hitting this sort of like, I don't think we've done it before, right? And a lot of, you know, sitting kind of behind the scenes with a lot of folks, and I have, you know, several times they work hard and then their editors are like, I just can't make it work, doesn't go to print, you know, and it's like, ooh, yeah, that's a lost opportunity, right? There's something there. It's not a reach, it's actually telling the story in a really important way, right? And I think that we have a lot more opportunity to do that if we sort of move away from individual stories, as compelling as they are. The problem with them always is that, you know, for someone, it just, you know, just, I think as you read that, right, you start to think that person represents a whole group, and it's just almost impossible for them to.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, one, it's just so funny to think of like me and Caitlyn Jenner in the same like coherent identity group. Like, I don't.
Outrageous.
But I mean, that is the point. So I have a podcast called Gender Reveal, and we talk to a different trans person normally every week. And Jules was on it and was in like just clearly the best episode we've ever had if you're looking for a place to start. But in general, the purpose of Gender Reveal was to talk to hundreds of trans people to sort of demonstrate what you're saying, which is that it is in a coherent category and everyone is having different experiences and coming from different identities, like outside of and within transness. And that has actually led to way more people describing themselves as trans because they could see a space for themselves in this term, because the term is so broad to be almost meaningless, but that does mean that there's space for a lot of people in it because it just goes and goes and goes and goes. And when we tell the same story about the same type of trans person over and over again, people who aren't that one specific type of trans person don't see a space for themselves in transness. And so I'm not saying like write transness more broadly as a recruiting tool, even though that's how I'm doing it, but I do think that it is more truthful when you can describe transness as a thing that like looks all of these many different ways instead of just picking like this one white trans child or this one white trans adult and being like, this is it, this is trans, you know, so.
It sort of speaks to the power of audio too, though, and the power of storytelling and first-person stories and the multiplicity you can get with multiple episodes of a podcast. And I'm wondering if like that's maybe a really powerful avenue for us to continue pursuing, and what kind of decision making goes into selecting guests for your podcast, Tuck?
Yeah, sure. So I think for me, the way that I try to write my interview questions is by listening to or reading every interview I can find by that person or anything they've written if they're a writer, and then just trying to ask them questions that I haven't heard them answer before, because a lot of people are asked the same questions every time and they end up with stock answers, and I want to push past that. And in addition, we're trying to look at sort of little pockets of the world, the pockets of society in which trans people are existing, but maybe we aren't hearing from them for whatever reason, or we're hearing from them but like not from a particular angle. And so often we'll do this sort of reverse pigeonhole or reverse stereotype interview where like we'll take a wrestler who is always interviewed by wrestling professionals about being trans, and instead we'll talk to them about wrestling because we're the only wrestler that we've ever talked to, but we don't need to talk to them about being trans because we know about that. Or like, you know, if we wanted to talk to Leo Baker, who's like a famous trans skateboarder and is always in skateboarding magazines about being trans, but instead we're just like, we know you're trans, but like, what is skateboarding? Like, what is an ollie? I truly don't know. You know, is that snowboarding? I don't know. And so I think like sort of that's what we're looking for, and that has led to the season that's coming up now is like weirdly esoteric, because we just started being like, what are groups of people that we have never talked about or never talked to, but there are trans people in these spaces, and like how can we reach them? As much as I love like all of my friends who are like white trans masculine writers, like it would be so easy for me to make a podcast that was just 15 white trans mas that have published a book in the last year, and that wouldn't necessarily like further us in the same way that like hopefully what we're doing ends up doing.
Hello. So I'm a SHRP alum, but these days I'm covering courts, so mostly federal court. And last week, I wrote about a proceeding in the Trans Connecticut student-athlete case, which is, I think, probably going to keep being a really big one. It was a little tough because normally in my job, we're especially a little bit like wonky, and it's kind of like, here's what the plaintiff thinks, here's what the defendant thinks, and that approach felt actively harmful in this case. The legal group backing the students who are suing is really SPLC classifies that as a hate group, so I don't have to. And I think we talk a lot in science about kind of false neutrality in both sides and where it's not appropriate, but I'm curious in this kind of legal, kind of wonkier context, if you have thoughts about how to approach those kinds of stories and what kind of context might be helpful there.
Yeah, it's tricky. As someone who is reading a district court, injunction affirmation on the Amtrak up here, I was like, oh yeah. I mean, every time, like I study law partially, but like not mainly. And every time I have to sit down and read a legal judgment, I'm always like, whoa, like, this is trippier than anything, because you got to get into the logic, right? And watching courts try to we're in a very interesting moment in terms of jurisprudence, because never has the legitimacy of the judiciary been, less obvious, less self-evident, right? And we never know what sort of rationale we're going to get, right? Things can really go in any direction these days. It's not clear what words mean. It's not clear what precedent means, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have to tell you that. On the other hand, there is, a couple of districts that are working really hard right now to try and define essentially how courts will approach trans issues, in part because courts did not approach trans people as a class until incredibly recently. It simply was a very piecemeal, random thing that happened sometimes. And there was no sense, it just, anyways. So it's interesting to me because, it's like, there's this, like the decision reading gender dysphoria into the Americans with Disabilities Act under certain circumstances. I've spoken about this on a podcast, but it's like one of the weirdest decisions I've ever read, where I was like, I see you're trying really hard. I don't get it personally. It's not what I would say, right? On the other hand, we have like Woodstock v. Clayton, one of the most conservative, ironclad, and the thing I was reading today, which is about the pending, issue in Arkansas around the bill banning gender affirming care for people under 18. I mean, I think that the district court has been very smart so far. It's like, it doesn't even matter if discriminating against trans people in and of itself, right, if they're a suspect class or that's, it's just sex discrimination, the end, heightened scrutiny, we can all go home, right, real easy, right? But that's a lot, right? Like, I just think that, like, even just to write a story, for example, that's like, what's the difference between making this decision on the basis of sex, which is such a highly politicized term now in a legal context, and making it based on trans people as a class, right? Like, that's a whole story right there, right? And then that gets even before you're getting to, like, how do I talk about the Alliance Defending Freedom, right? Like this group, right? It's helpful when the Southern Poverty Law Center is like, I got you. You can just quote us. We'll say hate group, right? But tracing the money, right? Like, there's a lot at stake, and I think part of the challenge I always think when I'm trying to figure out how to talk about law is like just getting my head into the head of people writing these decisions already messes me up, but then I lose my, so, I that's not an answer, but I think, ultimately kind of trying to figure out what's at stake sometimes is more maybe revelatory than the minutia of it, I guess. I don't know. I have to imagine part of this is just the challenge of writing about court processes at all right now when public, sort of faith in the judiciary is like, all the way down past floor one here. So, because I don't know if that changes it, right? Anyways, I'm not getting anywhere interested, so please.
No,
save
I don't
me.
know. I actually don't know if I have a great answer for you either, because I think the law makes it really challenging, and I think you are doing like what you can, which is noticing, who the two sides are, and like if you can name them as a hate group. And so something I'll just say broadly that you already know, but I think is like the most useful thing I can maybe contribute here, is just that, we know that when, certain papers of record and also others are writing about trans issues and they're trying to both sides things, they will weight inherently unequal things as if they are equal, right? And so if we look at some of like the most famous stories about trans youth, on one side we'll have trans adults, trans kids, some parents of trans kids, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Medical Association, the American Pediatric Association, various other associations, governments, blah, blah, blah. And then the other side will have like some moms went on Reddit and talked about how they don't think their trans kids are trans. And those are weighted as equal somehow. And so I think one thing that you can do, and it sounds like you are doing, is just sort of name who the stakeholders are in this. And, if it's uneven in this way, where it's like, all of these professional experts are on this one side, and on this other side are people that just like, woke up and decided to hate trans people for clout, then like, we can name that and not those words. The other thing that I think is sometimes interesting to note, or maybe extremely uninteresting depending on the article, is just like the words that they choose to use or not use, because so much of this legislation is about trans people but refuses to use the word transgender, right? And I think also a lot of this legislation, like, because it's written by people who hate trans people and don't care to learn about them, ignores the realities of what it means to be trans, and also like other identities like intersex identities. And so I think that we can also just look at laws and say, like, who did they try to affect? Who are they actually affecting? What were they trying to target here? Were they successful in that? Who would this target that they didn't even mean to target, and just sort of looking into the collateral damage of what they did because they're so bad at it. And yeah, I'm sure you're doing a great job, and I'm sorry that we aren't legal experts. But
No, I think you really got it, right? It's like that an adversarial proceeding, right, might lend itself to flattening the two parties, and it's just really helpful to dig into who they are. And sometimes the courts will do some work for you eventually, right? That's like a lot of these good district courts are like, yeah, so this side said this, and we looked into it. That doesn't make any sense, and absolutely does not pass the actual like we have tests for deciding how to admit scientific information, and one side is lying. Like some of these courts will a little bit do that, and maybe those are nugget moments, right, to really drive it home. But and I think the other challenge is that sometimes these suits are brought over mirages, right? Like Connecticut being kind of one of the famous but there are other ones too where it's like plaintiffs bring this damage that turns out didn't happen, never happened. Like, oh, my daughter couldn't win. Well, no, that didn't happen. Like literally, there was no trans girl for her to compete against, or like. She placed like 14th, like, sorry, honey, like, like she, it's just like there are, or like, the same thing when states pass laws about kids that ostensibly don't exist at the moment. Like, we have to stop these girls from playing soccer in Utah. And it's like, well, we checked there aren't any. So what are you doing? Right? Like those moments, right, where you're actually just reporting the fact, right, is like, whoop, that's the linchpin of it all right there, right? But, it really depends on the story. Yeah. No, and thank you for doing this work because, like, as someone who, again, has to read these decisions once they come out and they make me scratch my head, I really rely on journalists putting it in context, so appreciate it. Yeah.
So I want to get back to the healthcare issue in the institutional medicine context that we're operating in so often against our will sometimes. So the DSM, this gender, we've been talking about the gender dysphoria diagnosis, and in my reading to try to get more up to speed for tonight, I initially saw something saying, this was great, we got this diagnosis in the DSM, now this is going to validate the experience of so many trans kids and adults, and now you can possibly, if you have access to insurance and healthcare, get coverage for this treatment. On the other hand, it's pathologizing, it's medicalizing, and I also read stuff saying, look, it cuts the other way. Is that a useful diagnosis? Where do we go with that kind of info?
Finally got to the DSM.
I gave you an easy one.
No, it's important though, because I think it's one of these, part of my reaction, however many months ago it was to that particular New York Times story where I wrote a post on my Substack that was just like, here's some questions I wish papers would ever answer, right? And one of them is like, where does this thing come from? Why do we have a DSM? What's the DSM, right? Like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual? I hope we haven't all read it in this room. I mean, it's too long to read anyways. It's like, look, it's this classificatory taxonomy of mental disorders and diseases. Like, that's suspect on arrival, right? And there's a compelling argument to be made that's been made by many activists for as long as there's been a DSM that these kind of medical Bibles simply codify social distaste and stigma and call them diseases and disorders, right? Being gay was in the DSM till 1973, and the only reason it's not is because of gay activists. However, soon as homosexuality was taken out, what got put in the DSM? Gender identity disorder, and was used to try and basically practice conversion therapy on, gender nonconforming children, right? So it's like, to arrive at a story where the DSM just exists, right? And I understand, it's like, to piggyback off that last question, I've read the district court being like, of course we take the DSM to be true because we must act that way, right? And it's like, sucks to be you, but we're not the district court. We don't have to do that, right? And so, we're living in this era of partial depathologization. Gender dysphoria, which is in the DSM, if you go look it up, technically speaking, means being trans is not a mental illness. In fact, being trans is not a condition at all. Gender dysphoria is not necessarily synonymous with being trans. Gender dysphoria just means that you experience some kind of incongruence between your felt sense of who you are and either how you're perceived or how you experience your body in the world. The ICD, the International Classificatory, blah, 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 whatever, I don't know, the international version, WHO adjacent kind of thing, right, has an even less wonky version, gender incongruence, very chill, except again that word gender is there. Anyways, but you know, like we're getting, it's better than it used to be. It used to be pretty nasty. It was a paraphilia, right? Like, you know, when the Americans with Disability Act was passed, they explicitly put in trans people under a list of excluded people alongside, like, hey, pedophiles and, you know, other people. You know, it was like not a nice thing to be labeled as. But right, like in practice, do clinicians still treat, you know, gender dysphoria as a mental illness and treat trans people as mentally ill every single second? And are you required also to still see psychiatric providers who will get to evaluate your competency in order to access something that has nothing to do with your mental health, aka like a hormone prescription? Yeah, so, you know, have we achieved escape velocity? No. Is depathologization, you know, a good in and of itself? A lot of trans activists historically would say yes. Are you getting any insurance coverage in this country without it? Nope. So it's like these very complicated, right? And I think it would be an interesting question to entertain. Again, like sort of, one, how would we tell that story as a product of struggle? Gender dysphoria is a product of struggle. You know, WPATH, another acronym that I think whenever it appears, the question should be asked, like, what is this thing? Where did it come from? Do trans people like WPATH? Do trans people help create WPATH?
I don't know what that is. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
What is WPATH?
Yeah, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, you know, which we've probably heard a little bit about lately because they just dropped new standards of care, which are this sort of, you know, idealized document that everyone's supposed to follow. If you go and look at the shenanigans going on behind these standards of care, I mean, the infighting of it all, and like we were all bracing for very bad standards of care because like, this is not, it has appeared to some of us as if anti-trans crusaders have frankly infiltrated parts of WPATH. WPATH has always been the product of struggle, but like some of them are just like, I'm going to go into WPATH and rewrite these standards of care to harm people, right? Which is like, you know, not totally breaking with its history. And then they release, you know, I was part of lots of people, you know, contributed to the draft and tried to, you know, push back on really egregious stuff. They drop the new final, you know, they drop the new issue, the new standards of care, and they actually look kind of okay. And then a week later, they dropped a bunch of revisions that put all this terrible stuff back. And I was like, really? You're going to do that? Right? So anyways, there's a story, right? Not the story that we got in the news. Now, you know, in a different world, I would probably ask the question, like, does everybody need to know about this, right? Like, maybe if I think it helps advance the cause of criticizing WPATH, because I'm not very happy with them. I don't want to live in a world with WPATH or the DSM. It's the one we live in right now. How to cover all of that? Very tricky, I think, right? How much to get into the weeds? But I will say that the coverage to date has almost uniformly failed, like every basic test I have for it, on how to do that responsibly, because it's just like, here is this thing, right? Obviously, we think if there's a world association, it must be legit, except if we're also going to give airtime to its critics who just don't like trans people. Who's missing? The trans people caught up in the middle, right? So anyways, sorry, I'm totally like getting fired up. I'm going to pass it to
I don't even remember the question. I just have things to say about what you said.
Talk about WPATH.
Well, I mean, the thing that's funny about WPATH is like people, you know, like do trans people like WPATH? Is WPATH good or bad? It's like sort of like the Democratic Party. It's like it could be worse. It could be better. It depends on where you are physically, whether you're trying to get more rights or whether less, right? They're either helping you or hurting you, and it just depends on where you are. If that's helpful to anyone. But what was the other thing I was going to say about stands? You were just reminding me, and this isn't about your question at all, but I just wanted to sort of name that trans reporting and trans health reporting, trans science reporting, like it is a beat just like any other beat. And so I don't expect everyone to like automatically know what WPATH is or automatically know like the ins and outs of trans healthcare, because I do think it's a beat. And something you'll notice if it becomes your beat is that they're talking to the same two trans women at WPATH every single time, because they can get, some of you know who they are, because you can get them to say like vaguely transphobic things about how there are too many trans kids these days. And so reporters could be like, well, this is a trans woman and she works at WPATH and she is saying that there's too many trans kids these days, and so I will use her as my source and no one can argue with me. And okay, she can be a source. I'm not saying she can't be a source, but it's really telling when like sort of just saying both sides articles go to the same two people to make sort of anti-trans arguments over and over again. You'll also see the same two, like, women in their 20s who detransitioned, who are interviewed over and over again as, like, the spokespeople for detransition teens, even though they were not teens when they transitioned. They were like 24, but they're like, but I regretted it, and maybe some teens will also regret it. But it's like the same three. So I just think that's something to keep in mind as well when you're even just reading coverage of trans issues, is, are you seeing the same 2 or 3 people being trotted out as sort of the anti-trans voice over and over again? And if so, why? Yeah.
Please.
Obviously, there's a lot of like discrimination and struggle, but how can we think of, or what is the place for joy in covering trans issues, trans health? Like, how can we think of stories that are not just everything that we've been talking about so far?
Yeah, I think it's like the perfect moment for this question and this conversation too, because, and maybe it's just because, I'm living in the same world as the rest of y'all. I'm always like, joy? Do I remember that feeling? Just kidding. I do experience joy, just for the record. But I think part of the challenge, right, is that in a very polarized moment, I think a lot of things are presented to us like here's the poison and we need to have some room for antidote. But I actually think in reality, it doesn't, like, mercifully doesn't quite work that way. I think for me, and I think this maybe picks up on part of how you were talking about gender reveal, and part of what I think about a broader atmosphere or ecology, media, ecology that we all live in is like, it's not that I want more or less of this or that trans okay, that's not true. I clearly have come out against some things, but what I really want, what I actually think would be transformative, would be for there to not just be like positive, negative, like dysphoria, euphoria, right? To sort of shatter, I'm not going to use the binary word, but to think about, what if there were just so many different kinds of trans stories, right, in journalism? And what if there was a broader media ecology where it actually never added up to any one thing? And I think that would be helpful, actually not at the level of representation, not in terms of accuracy, but in basically preempting people from reducing all trans people or all trans experience down to one thing. It would eliminate the possibility of someone who seems obsessed with my book, though he's never read it, always tweeting about the trans debate. I'm like, there's no such thing as that. That doesn't exist. You made that up. It's like, it's your project. Now you have to sink or swim with it. But like, I don't want to be at the trans debate, right? I don't want there to be a the. I don't want there to be a debate. But, like to think about basically any number of stories, right? And I think, I have to say, trans journalists are out there doing that. Like, honestly, there have been some, like, oh my God, some great stories this summer, which, like, feel lucky that I got to, like, be a source in some of them, like the DIY orchiectomy barn. Shout out to that in the Independent. There are some great stories about phalloplasty this summer. Like, there was some good reporting, and some of them, or the ones that were good, I mean, were all written by trans journalists, because not just because they get it, but actually because I think they were interested in telling a range of stories, and the frame, whatever the lead was for each of those, it was just so clear once you get into the story that it doesn't all add up to one thing. And when I read stuff like that, or have the pleasure, of talking to journalists like that, I'm like, we're good. We know how to do this. There's no problem here, right? And there's no reason. You do not have to be trans to do that. You don't even have to know trans people. But if you take that kind of ethic and care, I just think what would happen, right, if there weren't just like 5 really awesome stories, it's proportionate to me, right? Like 5 incredible stories. And, that one in the Independent was like, maybe the only good trans piece of journalism in the entire United Kingdom for the last 10,000 years, right? It's like, but what if we were to start to, change the balance, right? Or just proliferate to the point where it's not so easy for people to pin it all on one idea, right? I really actually think that would have meaningful benefits for trans people in the world, but I also just think it would be more enjoyable, right? I mean, I would love to read all of that stuff. I am someone who, as a scholar, is just sitting on 10, 100 million interesting trans stories that I'll never get to tell. It's just the nature of my work, and I always think like, I'd love to hand these off to other people. And so, kind of fostering that environment, I wonder if, that to me, so joy, yes, but also ennui, also boredom, also frustration, also depression, also whatever, every feeling out there, I think that would be really exciting to me and actually quite meaningful.
Yeah, I love the Orky Barn story is like my go-to, the one that I was going to mention. I think that I have so many thoughts on this. I was like, Jules, I have a project I'm working on. I need to tell you about. We'll talk later. But it's really to sort of combat this sort of this insistence that trans people need to be like pure suffering or pure like euphoria. And I think that there's a lot of ways to avoid this. And one is honestly, trans people are so funny. We've clearly demonstrated this, but trans people are really funny. And we never get to be funny because like all of the stories are like, we could die. But even when we could die, like we are funny about it and we still don't get to do it. And so I think that like creating space for levity and creating space where the stakes of the story maybe isn't like, does that trans person get to transition, or like is that trans person thrown out of their family, but it's maybe like a fun story like the orchiectomy barn, or which still has high stakes, but like it's a fun story, or just something even more fun that I'm not thinking about right now because there are so few examples of it. I just think that is like really cool to find stories about trans people that aren't about like whether or not they get to be trans, but just like here's a trans person doing something cool, which I guess is what we're trying to do on Gender Reveal. And then also, yeah, just to be looking around in general around all beats and not just saving trans stories, obviously, for the beats of trans issues TM, but like trans people can obviously be a source in any story. And so just looking around to see like if there are trans people in whatever beat you're in, or like, trans doctors or healthcare providers or whatever that can be in your story that isn't about trans health, but they're just sort of incidentally there. And I think that that's also a way to like treat us as human, right? To not treat us as aliens because we're actually around all the time. We're not just there when cis people are arguing about whether we should exist or not. So.
De-dramatizing would be a word I would use, right? We de-dramatize the coverage, de-exceptionalize, and all of a sudden there's so many more stories you can tell that might be really compelling or just like chill. I would love a chill story.
Yeah.
It's been a minute.
We're just trying to vibe. Like someone let us vibe.
Some of us are millennials.
Seriously, listen to Gender Reveal. You'll get so many story ideas, and you will laugh, and you will cry, and you will have the in-between feelings too. I really enjoyed it. So, that is something that I noticed in a lot of the episodes is the levity's right there. It's not like you're making it or manufacturing it. It emerges. And is that something about the format and that you've exploited that you're enjoying?
It's just that there are trans people talking to us or talking to each other. Like there's no like non-trans person in the room making us ask questions about whether or not we deserve to be there or how they can be better allies. No offense. Like I'm glad you're all here talking about it. But like when Jules and I were hanging out before this, we were talking a little bit about being trans, but in the context of like making fun jokes about like, like we were like goofing off and we were having a good time and we were laughing a lot. And then that is just what happens when trans people are talking to each other. And sometimes it's about being trans and sometimes it's about something else. And so it's not like I like am going into recording an episode and being like, you better make the people laugh so people know we're fun. Like, it's just like, we're just fun because you gotta laugh. Like everything is so bad, like you absolutely have to laugh. And you just gotta. I mean, Jules told one of the most incredible stories we've ever had on the podcast that was about a moment of deep suffering, but it was hilarious and, a performance for the ages.
But, gotta have the right conditions. Part of it is you run an amazing show, and I think, in my excitement. And I think it was actually, I feel like literally the day that we recorded, I feel like I had done some like very serious podcast that morning. And I was just having one of those days where I was like, wow, I've been talking into Zoom a lot and feeling a little depleted. And what is it all about? And I was so excited just to come and be absurd for like an hour, with you. And I just, because I felt comfortable and I had a sense of trust and I was allowed to do things that I just don't, necessarily want to do otherwise. And like, that was just such an amazing experience that I'm grateful for it. And, it's nice. I think if people get to be funny right? It's a good sign that they're not, as vigilant as they might normally have to be. And when you come from, a people who have just been facing, down some of the worst experiences that there are on the face of the earth, that's sad. But on the other hand, that means also like we just know shit that other people don't even know they don't know. We have powers and capacities that would like frighten and elate and other words, anyone. And it's like, your loss. It's everyone's loss not to have. It's not that everyone's entitled to access, but when trans people have to walk through the world, surviving, but also we do a lot of stuff amongst ourselves. Like there's just, there's a level of loss here, and I think that, being treated to some of that magic is a very rare privilege indeed, and one that, perhaps if things were better, we might be, in a better position to share a little more often. I mean, I'd say that often to family members who have a child who just came out. I'm like, okay, whatever you're feeling right now, cool, maybe go to therapy about it. Don't tell your kid. But here's one thing, right? Your kid is going to, your kid is great. Like, first of all, figured out something, came to you and was like, you're wrong. Everyone has been wrong my whole life. Like, that's really cool. That demonstrates incredible integrity and power. That commands respect. And ultimately, you are so lucky, because if you have a good relationship with that kid, if you can build a strong foundation and have that kid in your life and be supportive, you're going to get to learn things that stretch you way beyond how you would have walked through this world otherwise. And frankly, that is an immense privilege. It's not something to count on, and you may not get it if you don't do this right, but the reward there, like astronomical. Just take it from me, like someone who's lived through it. It's incredible to walk through the world as a trans person. You just have a level, a dimension, and a level of understanding and perception that goes well beyond what most people would ever have to use. And of course, that's hard earned, but it is really powerful once you start to value it. And it's pretty cool to have someone in your life who might sometimes share that with you. And so I think that to me is the basic question, right? Don't need to know that much about gender, right? You just need to, be open to being a supportive human being. I think that's a pretty cool thing to do.
Yeah, and I know we're at time. Yeah, I know we're at time. So I was just going to say that, like, I really appreciate, this is a long event. And I appreciate you all being here. I appreciate you all listening. But also, like, because I was talking to Jules about this on the train, like, I find that, like, these days especially, the people who are coming to learn about the work are the people who are already doing the work really, really well, because you all are the ones who care enough to learn about it, and the people who need this are never going to listen. And so I just really appreciate you, like, all being the kind of people who are, like, for whatever personal or professional reason, like, feel invested in this topic. Because there are so many people who will just never see us as human beings. And the only thing that we can really do to combat that is have people who do see trans people as human beings, like, also telling stories and, like, hopefully getting to positions of, like, even editorial power. And so I just appreciate you all, like, being part of that. And I, like, is it sad that I'm like, thank you for maybe seeing me as a human being, I'm assuming, but, like, I don't know, that's where we're at, guys. So, like, thank you.
Well, we do reject self-congratulations in journalism generally, but thank you. And this has been a wonderful event. I can't imagine a better kickoff event for in-person return to Kavli Conversations. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and time with us tonight. That's all we have.
Thank you.
Thank you.